quiet mountain town that most people would not even notice on a map. The town was small, peaceful, and predictable. People woke up early, shops opened slowly, and everyone knew everyone else's routine by heart. Nothing surprising ever happened there, and that was exactly why the townspeople were startled the day a group of human volunteers arrived for a long-term research project. They were not loud, not dramatic, and not even trying to attract attention. Yet the entire town noticed them instantly. From the very first day, the volunteers acted in a way that felt warm and unusual to the locals. They greeted strangers with bright smiles. They held doors open for anyone walking behind them. They laughed loudly at the simplest jokes. They waved at children, complimented elders, and stopped to take pictures of flowers as if the smallest things were treasures. The townspeople had met visitors before, but these volunteers behaved as if they were excited about everything, even the cracks in the sidewalk. A few older villagers sat near the community market and watched the newcomers walk by. One of them whispered that humans were adorable, almost like friendly puppies who didn't know how to be anything but sweet. The others nodded in agreement. The volunteers seemed curious about everything, sometimes tripping on uneven stones, sometimes asking innocent questions about farm tools or traditional clothes. Their excitement made the locals smile without even realizing it. Every morning, the volunteers would walk down the main road with their backpacks, waving at every single person they passed. They always said, "Good morning," even to people who barely lifted their heads. Some villagers found it amusing that the volunteers were enthusiastic even before breakfast. One man joked that humans woke up in sunrise mode, always ready to explore something new. The volunteers didn't get angry or embarrassed when they made mistakes. They laughed at themselves, which made others feel comfortable around them. It didn't take long for the volunteers to become known in different corners of the town. At the bakery, they would always buy more bread than they needed, simply because they liked sharing it with children who passed by. At the small grocery shop, they helped the owner organize boxes without being asked. At the old fountain near the town center, they often sat between errands, feeding stray cats and trying to convince the shyer ones to come closer. The townspeople found this behavior heartwarming because most visitors ignored those cats. One afternoon, a few volunteers helped a farmer carry heavy baskets of vegetables up a steep path. The farmer was surprised because he never asked for help. They simply saw he was struggling, and without any hesitation, they rushed to assist him with big smiles. They talked about how beautiful the mountain looked that day, even though they were sweating and out of breath. The farmer later told others that humans were full of spontaneous kindness, like their hearts reacted faster than their thoughts. Children in the town began to follow them around, not because the volunteers gave them gifts or did anything impressive, but because they were fun to talk to. They never dismissed a child's silly questions or stories. They listened with focus and reacted with genuine excitement. If a child showed them a drawing, the volunteers acted like it was a masterpiece. If a child talked about school, they encouraged them with simple but warm words. This made the children feel important, and soon every kid in the town knew at least one volunteer. The volunteers also had a habit of trying new things with sincere curiosity. When they saw the locals weaving baskets, they tried to learn. They were terrible at it, but they kept laughing and encouraging each other. When someone showed them how to bake a traditional bread, they followed the instructions with wide eyes, as if they were learning ancient secrets. Even when they burned a batch and filled the kitchen with smoke, they apologized, bowed repeatedly, and promised to do better next time. The locals found their innocence almost cartoon-like in the best possible way. As days passed, the town began to feel brighter, simply because the volunteers were around. Sometimes they helped tourists find their way. Sometimes they ran after people who forgot their shopping bags. Sometimes they stood beside elders who were crossing the street slowly. None of these actions were dramatic, but they built an image of humans as sweethearted, playful, and harmless. One thing that stood out the most was the volunteers' habit of rescuing animals. Whether it was a bird stuck in a fence, a kitten hiding under a car, or a dog limping near the market, the volunteers reacted instantly. They handled every creature with gentle hands, whispering soothing words even though the animals couldn't understand them. Locals were touched by how naturally the volunteers cared for life around them. It seemed that their instinct was always kindness, first in the evenings. The volunteers gathered at the small guest house where they stayed. People walking by often heard laughter, stories, and cheerful arguments about whose day was the funniest. They talked loudly, not out of rudeness, but because they were excited to share everything they saw. The locals liked hearing these sounds. It made them feel as though youth and energy were filling the air again. For a town where the population was mostly elderly, this was refreshing. One night, a few locals joined them at an outdoor seating area near the guest house. It started with polite greetings, but within minutes, the volunteers had pulled everyone into a lively conversation about life in the mountains, traditional beliefs, and local festivals. They asked simple but sincere questions, the kind that made people remember why they loved their own hometown. Some villagers confessed they hadn't talked that openly in years. It was surprising how easily the volunteers broke the walls around people's hearts. Researchers who oversaw the volunteer program observed all this from a distance. They had seen many volunteers before, yet this group had a unique charm. They were not perfect. They stumbled, mispronounced local words, lost their way, and even dropped things occasionally. But instead of getting frustrated, they laughed it off. Their mistakes made people feel connected to them, because it showed their human side soft, flawed, but full of warmth. Even local journalists noticed the volunteers' presence. They came with cameras and notebooks, expecting a short assignment, but instead, they found themselves captivated by the volunteers' natural behavior. One journalist described them as people with sunshine personalities, who made the quiet town feel like a lively festival without trying. Another wrote that humans were adorable in the gentlest, purest way imaginable, because their kindness was sincere and spontaneous. As the days turned into weeks, the town developed a soft fondness for the volunteers. Shopkeepers set aside extra goods for them. Elders saved seats in shaded spots for them. Children ran towards them as soon as they appeared. The volunteers didn't notice how much influence they were having. To them, they were simply being themselves. But to the villagers, these humans brought a fresh wave of life that felt rare and precious. The townspeople often gathered near the fountain in the evenings, smiling as they watched the volunteers pass by. One elderly woman once said that humans were adorable because they lived with their hearts open, without fear of appearing foolish or emotional. Others agreed, saying that their innocence was not childish, but a sign of genuine goodness. No one in the town imagined that beneath all this sweetness, there might be another side to them, a side that only appeared when truly needed. For now, everyone saw them as cheerful, harmless, and endearing. They were sunshine in human form, wandering through the streets with curious eyes and gentle hands. They made the world feel softer simply by being present. And although the villagers didn't know it yet, the day would come when this softness would disappear, replaced by something far stronger. But that moment was still far away. For now, all they saw were adorable humans spreading laughter wherever they went. The same gentle rhythm that had settled over the mountain town since the volunteers arrived. The townspeople had grown comfortable seeing those cheerful humans everywhere smiling at strangers, helping anyone who needed a hand, and walking around with their bright curiosity. But slowly, without anyone planning it, the town began noticing something new, something deeper, something that showed the volunteers were not just adorable or friendly. They had a hidden strength that didn't show itself, unless the situation demanded it. It started on a foggy morning when a hiker from the town went missing in the upper hills. The man had gone out early, planning to return before midday, but he never showed up. His family became worried, and the villagers spread the word. Most of them assumed it was going to be a long wait for the official rescue team from the city, which usually took several hours to arrive. That was how things worked. Everyone expected a slow process, full of uncertainty, but the volunteers didn't wait. As soon as they heard someone was lost, their expressions changed. The smiles faded, but not because they were upset. Instead, they suddenly became focused and sharp, almost as if an invisible switch inside them had been flipped. The same volunteers who usually tripped over uneven stones now moved with fast, confident steps. They asked clear questions about where the hiker was last seen, what the weather had been like, how steep the area was, and what equipment he usually carried. Villagers watched in surprise. They had never heard the volunteers speak in such calm, serious tones. These were the same people who laughed while feeding stray cats, yet now they acted like trained rescuers. Without hesitation, the volunteers divided themselves into small teams and packed supplies, flashlights, water bottles, ropes they had brought for research work, and emergency blankets. One of them quickly marked areas on a map, while the others prepared to leave. By the time the official rescue team was notified, the volunteers were already halfway up the hills. Their usual clumsy energy was gone. They moved smoothly and quickly, helping each other climb over rocks and thick bushes. They communicated in short, simple messages, checking the surrounding area without wasting time. People from the town who followed them were surprised at how organized they were. The volunteers stayed calm even in thick fog, calling out gently but clearly, listening carefully for any sign of a response. After hours of searching, one volunteer found footprints in a damp patch of ground. They followed the trail until they heard a faint sound, someone calling for help. The lost hiker had slipped on a narrow path and injured his leg. He was scared and tired, unsure how long he had been there. But when he saw the volunteers rushing towards him, he felt relief wash over him. They didn't panic. They reassured him, helped him drink water, and checked his injury with careful hands. Then they built a temporary stretcher from branches and rope and carried him down the hill together, taking turns so no one became too tired. The villagers who watched this rescue felt a shift in their hearts. The volunteers were sweet and gentle, yes, but now everyone saw another side of them, a side that was steady, strong, and quietly brave. It was almost strange to imagine these were the same people who giggled while trying to weave baskets a few days earlier. News of the rescue spread quickly. Some people thought it was luck. Others believed the volunteers were simply well-trained. But the truth revealed itself again only a week later when a sudden rainstorm hit the town. It was one of those storms that arrives too quickly, turning clear skies into dark clouds before anyone has time to react. The streets became slippery, and people rushed to bring their animals inside. A small group of schoolchildren walking home struggled to keep their footing as the rain grew heavier. The volunteers appeared out of nowhere, running through the rain with their jackets over their heads. They guided the children to safe spots, one volunteer lifting a frightened kid onto their shoulders so the child wouldn't fall. Another held the hand of a toddler who could barely walk on wet ground. Even though the rain soaked them completely, they stayed cheerful for the children's sake. But beneath their smiles was a firmness that impressed the adults watching. Once the children were safe, the volunteers continued helping around the town. They cleared clogged drains so water wouldn't flood the shops. They helped an elderly couple move their furniture away from leaking windows. They carried sandbags to places where the water was rising too fast. They didn't hesitate, didn't complain, and didn't slow down. Their clothes were drenched, their shoes muddy, but they kept going until the storm softened. After the storm ended, the volunteers quietly returned to their guest house to dry off, acting as if nothing special had happened. But the villagers couldn't stop talking about it. They admired how the volunteers remained gentle, but turned serious when things became difficult. They didn't brag about what they did. They didn't expect praise. They simply helped because someone needed help. For many in the town, this became a moment of reflection. They realized that humans, even when they appeared soft and adorable, carried a kind of inner strength that didn't announce itself. It only appeared when something important was at stake. This made the volunteers even more fascinating to watch. The villagers started paying closer attention to them, curious about how they balanced kindness and quiet power. More small moments revealed this hidden side. One morning, a villager accidentally dropped a heavy crate on his foot. Before anyone else reacted, 2 volunteers rushed over, lifted the crate, and supported him so he could sit down. Their movements were fast but careful, as if they were used to responding to emergencies. When another villager fell off a bicycle, the volunteers appeared again, helping her stand, checking that she wasn't badly hurt, and guiding her to a bench to rest, even during casual activities. The townspeople noticed their discipline. When a local craftsman showed them how to carve wooden ornaments, the volunteers watched closely, practicing with full concentration. They weren't just curious. They were patient, determined, and willing to keep trying until they improved. Their laughter returned only after they felt they had understood the basics. One afternoon, the volunteers went hiking with a group of villagers. The path was long and uneven, but the volunteers walked steadily, helping anyone who struggled. When a villager's backpack strap tore, a volunteer fixed it with a strong knot using a piece of extra fabric. When a child got tired, one of them carried the child on their back without looking bothered. The villagers realized that the volunteers' strength wasn't only physical, it came from their attitude. They refused to let anyone feel left behind. The more the townspeople observed them, the clearer it became. The volunteers were not adorable by accident. They chose kindness because it made people feel safe and happy. But beneath the gentle smiles was a layer of discipline and bravery, shaped by experiences the villagers didn't know about. These humans had depth. There was softness on the outside and steel on the inside. Some evenings, the villagers even overheard the volunteers practicing emergency drills behind the guest house. They weren't loud, but the movements were firm and practiced. It was surprising because they never talked about it. They didn't boast about their abilities. They didn't show off. They simply prepared themselves quietly, as if ready for anything. This made the townspeople think differently about them. At first, everyone thought the volunteers were like cheerful travelers, easygoing, curious, and harmless. But now, the villagers saw that humans were far more layered than they seemed. Their smiles came easily, but seriousness came even faster when needed. Their playful nature hid a readiness to protect others. Their clumsy moments hid a sense of responsibility. And their gentle behavior hid a strength that even they didn't talk about. By the end of that month, the town had developed a new respect for them. They still found the volunteers adorable, but now they understood that the sweetness was only the visible part. Under it was a spirit that stayed calm in danger, reacted fast when someone was in trouble, and worked tirelessly when others were afraid. The villagers didn't know it yet, but these quiet signs were only the beginning. There would come a moment soon, something bigger, more frightening, and far more serious, when the whole mountain town would witness the full force of what humans were capable of. And when that moment came, no one would ever think of humans as simply adorable again. On a day that looked normal at first, the mountain sky was clear, the air was cool, and the town moved at its usual slow rhythm. The volunteers walked through the streets with their usual cheerful energy, waving at people, buying fresh bread, talking to children, and planning their research tasks. Nothing felt unusual. No one had any reason to think the calm would end so suddenly, but nature rarely warns before it changes. Around midday, a strange smell drifted through the air. It was faint at first, something like the scent of heated wood carried by a soft breeze. Most people ignored it. A few villagers looked up at the mountain slopes, noticing a distant haze. They thought it was just dust or maybe a passing cloud. But the haze didn't move like a cloud. It stayed in one place, slowly growing thicker. Soon after, a villager came running from the forest edge, his face pale, his breath uneven. He shouted that he saw smoke rising from the dry trees. People around him froze. Fires were rare in their region, but not impossible. The air had been dry for weeks, and a single spark could spread quickly. The townspeople gathered and looked toward the mountain slope. Now the haze was no longer hiding smoke lifted clearly into the sky, turning from gray to a darker shade. A quiet panic began spreading among the villagers. They weren't prepared for something like this. Most of them had never faced a large wildfire before. The older ones had heard stories, but hoped they would never see one themselves. As the fear grew, the volunteers heard the commotion and rushed toward the gathering crowd. Their faces changed the moment they saw the smoke. Gone were the cheerful smiles that usually lit up their expressions. They didn't look frightened, but focused sharp and alert, as if every sense in their body had suddenly activated. Some villagers were unsure what to do. Others talked nervously, saying the rescue teams from the city might take too long to arrive. People started thinking about their homes, their animals, their families. Some felt frozen in place. Others wondered if they should start running. The confusion grew heavier with every passing second, but the volunteers stepped forward before the panic could rise any higher. Their voices were calm, steady, and clear. They spoke gently but firmly, asking the villagers to stay together. They asked simple questions about who needed help, who had trouble walking, which houses had children or elders inside, and which animals needed to be moved first. They listened carefully to every answer. Without waiting for instructions, they split into groups, each group focusing on a different task. Some went toward the houses closest to the forest line, helping families gather important belongings. Others guided villagers toward safer areas farther from the smoke. Another group checked the paths leading up the mountain to understand how fast the fire was spreading. The transformation was incredible to watch. These same humans who had spent weeks being gentle, curious, and playful now moved with quick, precise steps. They didn't shout, they didn't waste time, and they didn't hesitate. Their determination was powerful but quiet, like a force that knew exactly what needed to be done. More smoke rolled down the mountain as the wind shifted. Birds flew out of the trees, their wings beating fast. The volunteers immediately told the villagers to keep away from the forest edge and stay where the air was clearer. Even in this stressful moment, the volunteers remained calm enough to comfort those who were trembling or crying. One of them helped an elder sit down and breathe slowly, guiding them through simple instructions to reduce their fear. Another carried a small child whose legs were shaking too much to walk. As word spread through the town, more families stepped outside, confused by the sudden noise and the smell of smoke. The volunteers went door to door, checking if anyone needed help. They lifted heavy objects, pushed open stubborn doors, and guided pets into safe areas. They made sure no one was left behind. Some villagers tried to help, but didn't know how. The volunteers gently explained what tasks were safe and which ones to avoid. They reassured the villagers that working together was important. Their confidence gave people hope, even though the fire on the mountain was growing stronger. A deep rumble was heard in the distance, not from the fire, but from the wind pushing through the trees. The smoke rose higher, and a few dry branches crackled from far away. The sound echoed faintly through the valley. The volunteers understood immediately that they had less time than they thought. They gathered the villagers in the open square at the center of the town. They spoke with clear voices, explaining what needed to happen next. Some families needed to move to lower ground. Others needed help carrying supplies. The volunteers kept moving, guiding, lifting, checking, and protecting. Even though their faces were serious, they never looked afraid. Their calmness spread to the villagers, helping them breathe a little easier. Children clung to their parents, watching the volunteers with wide eyes. They had always seen them as friendly and funny, but now they saw something entirely different, a deep strength that didn't show itself until the moment truly mattered. The volunteers stayed near the children, comforting them with soft words and gentle gestures. Even while handling serious tasks, they made sure no child felt a lone dot as the fire continued to spread. The volunteers found creative ways to slow down the risk. They cleared dry leaves and brush near the outer houses. They helped villagers store water in buckets and containers, just in case the fire pushed farther down. They coordinated with a few strong villagers to move equipment, tools, and animals to safer spots. Every action they took came from instinct, training, and a deep desire to protect. The villagers were amazed at how well the volunteers worked together. They communicated with small hand signals and quick phrases, wasting no time. Their teamwork was smooth, almost practiced, even though none of them bragged about knowing anything special. They didn't stop to rest, even when sweat formed on their faces or smoke made their eyes sting. Their focus didn't break. A few villagers wondered how people so soft-hearted could become so strong so suddenly. It felt like watching two sides of the same person, one gentle, one powerful, both existing in perfect balance. As the afternoon passed, the fire still burned on the upper mountain slope, but the volunteers had managed to help everyone evacuate the risky areas. No one was hurt, no one forgotten. The villagers gathered in a safe open field, watching the mountain with heavy hearts. Some cried softly. Others held each other's hands. The volunteers moved among them, offering water, comfort, and quiet support. They didn't rest even now. They checked on everyone, making sure each person felt safe. They stayed close to the elders, the children, and the frightened ones. They didn't talk about what they had done. They didn't expect thanks. They simply stayed until every villager had regained some strength and calm. Only then did the villagers realize how much the volunteers had changed the situation. Without them, the panic would have been overwhelming. People might have run in different directions, creating more danger. The volunteers had taken charge, not with force, but with calm guidance. They turned fear into organization, confusion into action. The villagers whispered among themselves, saying they had never seen humans like this before. They were still the same adorable people who fed stray cats and laughed at small jokes. But now everyone understood a hidden truth. Humans could be gentle because they chose to be. But when danger rose, they became something else: serious, focused, and incredibly brave. The town was safe for now, but the day was not over. And no one knew how much more the volunteers would have to face. The villagers watched them and felt both comfort and awe. These humans had shown a side of themselves that no one expected, a side that would only grow more visible as the story continued. The same open field where the villagers had gathered after the fire forced them to move from their homes. The smoke still floated in the distance, hanging like a heavy curtain around the mountain. Even though the villagers were safe for the moment, a quiet fear sat inside their hearts. No one knew what the night would bring. Fires were unpredictable. Winds could change suddenly. Anything could happen. But the volunteers didn't let fear spread. They walked among the villagers, offering small cups of water, guiding children to sit on blankets, and checking if anyone felt unwell from the smoke. Their movements were calm and steady, like they had trained for moments like these. Their gentle tone kept everyone grounded, even as the sky slowly darkened. Some villagers expected the volunteers to rest. They had spent the entire day running, lifting, guiding, and helping. Anyone else would have collapsed from exhaustion. But these humans didn't think about resting. Not yet. Their minds stayed alert, watching the mountain fire, paying attention to the breeze, and listening carefully to every small sound carried by the wind. A group of villagers gathered near the edge of the field and began whispering about what might happen next. They worried about their homes, their animals, and the memories stored inside their houses. Some feared that everything could be lost forever. One woman covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the uncertainty. Before her worry could turn into despair, one volunteer knelt beside her and spoke softly, reminding her that people mattered more than things. The volunteer promised that no one would be alone, no matter what happened. The woman looked up with teary eyes, surprised by the genuine care shining in the volunteer's expression. It was the kind of comfort that reached deeper than words. As evening approached, the townspeople noticed the volunteers forming small groups again, speaking quietly among themselves. They weren't planning to leave or abandon the villagers. Instead, they were preparing for the night ahead. They walked around with flashlights, checking the ground, clearing small dry branches, and making sure the field was safe for families to sleep if needed. Some villagers watched them and wondered where this deep sense of responsibility came from. These humans were visitors, not residents. They could have stepped back and waited for official teams to arrive, but they didn't. Helping wasn't something forced on them. It came naturally. When night finally settled over the valley, the fire on the mountain glowed like a dim orange line. The volunteers gathered the villagers close and explained that they would keep watch in shifts. No one needed to stay awake in fear. The volunteers would monitor the fire, the wind, and any changes in the surroundings. They asked the villagers to rest, even if only a little. The villagers hesitated at first. Trusting others during danger was difficult, but the volunteers' calm confidence convinced them to try. Slowly, families laid out blankets, children curled up beside their parents, and elders rested on cushions the volunteers had found earlier. The field turned quiet, except for soft breaths and occasional murmurs from people trying to sleep. The volunteers took their positions around the field. Some sat near the edges, eyes fixed on the mountain. Others walked slowly in wide circles, checking on every sleeping family without making noise. Their steps were light, but their focus was strong. They whispered updates to each other from time to time, discussing the fire's movement. Even in the dark, their teamwork was clear and steady. Hours passed like this. Then, near midnight, the wind shifted sharply. A cool gust blew across the field, carrying a stronger smell of smoke. One volunteer immediately lifted their head. They scanned the mountain slope and saw that the fire had flared up again. It wasn't rushing downward, but it had strengthened enough to cause concern. The volunteer quickly waved to others. They gathered in the center of the field, speaking in quiet but urgent voices. They didn't panic. They didn't make noise that could wake the villagers. Instead, they developed a new plan. Some would move closer to the forest line to monitor the situation directly. Others would stay near the villagers, ready to wake them if evacuation became necessary. Once the volunteers split up again, the situation changed rapidly. A deep sound echoed from the forest, like branches snapping under heat. A thin line of sparks appeared on a lower part of the slope. The fire wasn't dangerously close yet, but it was moving more unpredictably than before. The volunteers on the upper side signaled to the others, and soon the entire volunteer team began working in silence. One volunteer carefully woke a few villagers who were lighter sleepers, explaining that they needed help preparing buckets of water. The villagers, startled but trusting, followed instructions without raising alarm. The volunteers didn't want to frighten the families who were finally resting. especially the children. Instead, they created a quiet network of action. While most people slept peacefully, those who were awake watched the volunteers work with awe. Even though the fire loomed in the night, they did not look scared. They stayed calm, moving with purpose. They carried water, checked the wind direction, and kept their eyes on the glowing mountain. Their seriousness was steady and quiet, never dramatic, never loud. The villagers realized something powerful. These humans were not simply being brave. They were protecting people because it was their instinct to do so. They were gentle when the world was safe, but when danger appeared, they carried themselves like guardians. A few villagers whispered to one another about how much had changed since the volunteers first arrived. They used to see them as cute, cheerful, and harmless. But now they saw something deeper, something strong, something that didn't show itself unless it was truly needed. The fire still flickered on the mountain, but it didn't rush downward. The volunteers' careful monitoring and early warnings helped prevent any panic. By the time the wind softened again, the danger had reduced. The fire settled higher on the slope, moving sideways instead of toward the town. For the first time since the evening, one volunteer let out a small breath of relief. Another smiled quietly, not because everything was perfect, but because their efforts had bought time for the town. They exchanged nods, appreciating each other's strength. But they didn't celebrate. Instead, they continued their patrols, making sure nothing else threatened the town before sunrise. By morning, the villagers woke to find the volunteers still standing at their positions, eyes tired but determined. Some of them had dark circles under their eyes. Others had soot on their clothes, but none of them complained. They greeted the villagers with kind smiles, asking how they slept and whether they felt better. The villagers were deeply moved. They had never experienced a night like that. Fear mixed with comfort, danger mixed with hope. They realized that the volunteers had stayed awake the entire night, guarding them like quiet protectors. It wasn't their home. It wasn't their responsibility. But they treated the villagers like family. Throughout the morning, more official teams finally reached the town. They immediately praised the villagers for evacuating safely and for staying organized. But the villagers shook their heads and pointed to the volunteers. They told the officials that the humans were the reason everyone stayed safe. The officials were surprised when they saw how calm the volunteers looked. Even after a full night of work. As the sun rose over the valley, the villagers looked at the volunteers with a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. These humans, who once seemed adorable, playful, and gentle, had revealed their deeper side again. A side that didn't seek attention, but acted out of care. A side that didn't break under pressure. A side that protected without hesitation. And though the villagers didn't know it yet, this was not the last challenge the town would face. Something even more serious was approaching, a moment that would show, once and for all, why humans were adorable. Until they stopped. When the long and frightening night finally ended, the sky began to clear above the quiet mountain town. A soft light spread across the valley, touching the burnt trees and the smoke that still lingered in the air. People stepped out of their temporary shelters slowly, unsure of what the morning would show them. For hours they had been afraid that everything they owned would be gone. They expected to see their homes destroyed and their streets buried under ash. But when they looked around, their eyes widened in disbelief. Almost everything was still standing. Walls were dark from smoke, trees were damaged, and the air smelled like burnt wood, but the homes were still there. The school was still there. The small shops, the bakery, the library, even the old wooden bridge near the river, they were all still standing. People covered their mouths with shaking hands. Some cried quietly. Some simply stared at their town as if they could not believe what they were seeing. Then someone pointed toward the far end of the valley, toward the line where the flames had stopped. There, on the blackened ground, were the tired figures of the human research team. Their clothes were dirty, their skin covered in ash, and their movements slow. But they were smiling small, exhausted smiles that showed relief. The villagers began walking toward them. The ground was still warm under their feet. The smell of burnt earth was strong, but the people did not care. They needed to see those humans who had stayed behind when everyone else fled, the ones who had worked through the night without resting, the ones who had stood between the fire and their homes. As the villagers reached them, the humans stood straighter, almost shyly, as if embarrassed by the attention. One of the villagers, an older woman with gray hair, stepped forward. She looked at them for a long moment, her eyes soft and filled with emotion. Then she said in a trembling voice, "You saved our town." The humans shook their heads at once. They insisted they only did what anyone would have done. They said they were not heroes. They said they simply could not leave while people were still in danger. But the villagers knew better. Not many people could work for hours in heat and smoke, putting their own safety second and thinking only about strangers. Word spread quickly. People ran to get water, food, blankets, anything to help the tired humans. Some offered chairs for them to sit on, while others checked their hands for burns. The humans tried to wave it away, telling everyone they were fine, but the villagers refused to listen. They had seen the humans working through the night with nothing but determination and a will to protect. Taking care of them now felt like the least they could do. As everyone gathered around, the mood slowly shifted. Earlier, there had been fear and uncertainty. Now, there was admiration, respect, and a deep sense of gratitude. Children peeked out from behind their parents, looking at the humans with wide, curious eyes. They whispered to each other about how strong and brave the humans were. One little boy said softly, "They don't look adorable now. They look like protectors." The adults heard him and nodded quietly. They remembered how the volunteers had always seemed cheerful and friendly before the fire. They laughed loudly, helped strangers, tripped over their own feet sometimes, and often brought small surprises to the villagers, fresh fruits, handmade gifts, or funny little inventions from their lab. They were easy to like, easy to smile at, easy to call adorable. But last night had changed everything. When danger came, the sweetness disappeared, replaced by something powerful and serious. They had stepped into the fire without hesitation. They had given directions calmly when others were panicking. Their eyes had become focused, sharp, and alert. Their movements had been steady and purposeful, and they had refused to stop until everyone was safe. One of the villagers said quietly, "They are gentle because they choose to be. But when they decide to protect someone, they turn into something else." The others agreed. Later that afternoon, officials arrived, firefighters, investigators, reporters, and emergency workers. They expected to see devastation. They expected to see houses burned and a population in shock. Instead, they were stunned to hear that the town had survived almost entirely because of a small group of humans who were not trained firefighters, not soldiers, not emergency teams. They were simple researchers living in the mountains for their studies. Reporters rushed to interview the villagers. Cameras clicked, microphones appeared. But when the humans were asked to speak, they kept their answers short. They did not want to take credit. They said they only helped because there was no other choice. They insisted anyone else in their place would have done the same. Still, the villagers continued to tell the truth again and again. They spoke about how the humans had organized the evacuation calmly, how they had carried children and elderly people, how they had guided animals to safety, how they had created small barriers to slow down the fire, using whatever tools they had, how they had stayed awake all night, running from one part of the valley to another. The humans listened with embarrassed smiles. They kept saying it was a group effort, but the villagers knew it was more than that. As the days passed, the town slowly began to rebuild. People worked together to clean the streets, repair roofs, and cut away the burnt plants. And every day, the humans helped without being asked. Despite being tired, they joined in, lifting heavy wooden beams, clearing debris, and comforting anyone who felt overwhelmed. Their behavior left a strong impression on everyone. They did not act like visitors. They acted like members of the community. They cared. They helped. They showed up every day with the same energy and kindness that had won the villagers' hearts in the first place. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, the villagers held a small gathering in the center of the town. They brought food, lanterns, handmade gifts, and instruments. The air felt peaceful for the first time in days. A wooden stage had been built, and the humans were invited to stand on it. They were confused at first, unsure why the villagers wanted them there. And the oldest member of the town stepped forward. He held a small wooden plaque carved by a local craftsman. The plaque showed a mountain, a flame, and a group of humans standing in front of a row of houses. It was simple but powerful. The elder lifted it slowly and said, "This is our way of thanking you. You kept us safe. You protected our families. You protected our home. We will never forget that." The humans stood quietly, their eyes shining with emotion. They accepted the plaque together, holding it carefully as if it were something fragile and precious. The villagers applauded loudly, some with tears in their eyes. The celebration continued late into the night. There was music, laughter, and stories being shared. Children played, adults talked peacefully, and the humans stood at the center of it all, not as outsiders, but as trusted friends. And yet, deep down, everyone carried the same truth, a truth that had become clear during the fire. Humans may smile, laugh, and act soft and adorable on most days, but behind those warm expressions is a strength that appears only when it is needed most. When danger rises, when someone is in trouble, when a community needs protection, they become something powerful, determined, and unshakable. That night, as the dark sky filled with stars, the villagers felt safe, not because the fire was gone, but because they knew who had stood between them and the flames. They knew that gentleness was a choice humans made, not a weakness. And they knew that if anything ever threatened their town again, those same humans would stand firm without hesitation. From that day forward, the villagers never forgot the lesson they had learned. Humans were adorable, yes, but only when they wanted to be. When they stopped being adorable, they became protectors, quiet, brave, and unstoppable.